What if the collapse of emerging nations is not a failure of the system, but one of its most profitable features? What if every debt crisis, every currency crash, every lost decade hides a carefully engineered transfer of wealth that almost no one is taught to see? From the outside, the story is always framed the same way. A developing country opens its economy, foreign capital flows in, credit becomes abundant, growth accelerates. Politicians celebrate modernization, integration into global markets, and a future that finally seems within reach. Skyscrapers rise, stock markets surge, headlines talk about opportunity. But beneath that optimism, something far more dangerous is being built quietly, deliberately. The first illusion is development itself. Cheap loans denominated in foreign currencies create rapid expansion, but they also create dependency. Infrastructure is financed, consumption increases, imports explode, and local industries struggle to compete with global players. Backed by cheaper capital and stronger currencies. Growth looks real, but it is fragile because it is not driven by productivity. It is driven by leverage. Then comes the second illusion, stability. International institutions, rating agencies, and global banks reinforce confidence. Capital keeps flowing. Political leaders are praised as reformers, but the system is already rigged against the country. Debt is compounding. Interest payments rise. Currency risk grows silently, and the moment global conditions shift, higher rates, lower commodity prices, capital flight, the entire structure starts to crack. This is where the pattern reveals itself. When the currency weakens, foreign-denominated debt explodes overnight. What was manageable becomes impossible. Reserves vanish, inflation accelerates, the narrative suddenly flips. The same voices that once praised the country now blame it. Corruption, mismanagement, lack of discipline. The collapse is framed as self-inflicted, never structural. But here's the part rarely discussed. While nations descend into crisis, global powers do not lose. They reposition. Currency devaluation makes assets cheap. State companies, natural resources, land, energy infrastructure, ports, banks, all become available at a fraction of their real value. Capital that once entered as loans returns as ownership. This is not accidental, it is cyclical. It has happened in Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe. Different decades, different excuses, same result. Debt becomes leverage, crisis becomes acquisition, collapse becomes consolidation. And the most disturbing truth is this: the system does not need every country to succeed. It needs predictable failures, failures that generate extraordinary returns for those who understand the cycle and position themselves ahead of it. For global financial power, instability is not a risk. It is a strategy. The question is no longer whether this has happened before. The real question is, how many nations are already trapped in the early stages right now, believing they are growing when in reality they are being prepared for extraction? If this pattern feels uncomfortable, that is exactly the point. Because once you understand how collapses are engineered, you stop seeing economic crises as random disasters and start recognizing them as predictable outcomes of a system designed to reward a very small group at the expense of entire nations. This is not abstract. Theory. These mechanisms decide who keeps their savings, who loses their currency, who controls resources, and who becomes dependent for generations. If this perspective is already changing the way you see global development, debt, and financial aid, take a moment to engage. Leave a comment and share what surprised you most, or which country came to mind while you were listening. Understanding the system only works when more people question it openly. Support this kind of deep investigation by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. What we are uncovering here is not taught in schools, not explained in headlines, and rarely discussed honestly. And in the next section, we are going deeper into how these cycles are deliberately initiated step by step, long before any collapse becomes visible. It always begins with optimism, and that optimism is carefully engineered. Emerging nations are told they are standing at the edge of a breakthrough moment, a chance to finally close the gap with the developed world. Foreign capital arrives dressed as opportunity. Loans are offered with friendly language. Development banks speak of infrastructure, modernization, and integration into the global economy. The message is seductive. Borrow now, grow fast, and prosperity will follow. At first, it works exactly as promised. Money floods the system. Governments finance highways, airports, energy projects, and social programs. Consumers gain access to credit they never had before. Imports surge. Living standards appear to rise. Political leaders point to growth figures as proof of success. This phase feels like progress, but it is not organic growth. It is leverage-driven expansion, and leverage always demands a price. The critical detail is what those loans are denominated in, rarely in the country's own currency. They come in dollars, euros, or other reserve currencies. That single fact quietly rewires the entire economy. From that moment on, the nation's future is tied not to its productivity, but to exchange rates it does not control and monetary policies set thousands of miles away. As foreign money flows in, local currencies strengthen temporarily. This creates another illusion. Imports become cheaper. Foreign goods flood domestic markets. Local producers struggle to compete. Manufacturing weakens. The economy shifts away from production toward consumption. Growth becomes dependent on continued inflows of external capital rather than internal capacity. The country is not building resilience. It is building fragility. At the same time, political incentives distort decision-making. Leaders who deliver short-term growth are rewarded. Structural reforms that would strengthen independence but slow expansion are postponed. Debt piles up quietly because servicing it seems manageable while conditions are favorable. Rating agencies approve. International institutions applaud. The trap tightens invisibly. Then comes the moment that exposes everything. Global conditions change. Interest rates rise in advanced economies. Commodity prices fall. Investors seek safety. Capital begins to leave. The same currency that once felt stable starts to weaken. Suddenly, the debt burden explodes. What looked affordable becomes crushing overnight, not because the country changed, but because the rules of the game shifted. This is the first irreversible turn. The nation no longer controls its trajectory. Policy choices shrink. Emergency measures replace long-term planning. And the same institutions that encouraged borrowing now demand discipline, austerity, and sacrifice. The cycle has moved forward, exactly as it has countless times before. This is not the collapse yet. This is only the setup. The real extraction begins later, once the illusion of growth has fully collapsed and desperation replaces confidence. By the time a nation realizes something is wrong, the machinery is already locked in place. Debt no longer behaves like a tool for development. It becomes a system of control. Every policy decision, every budget debate, every political choice is now filtered through one question. How do we keep servicing the debt? This is where the illusion of sovereignty begins to collapse. On paper, the country still governs itself. In reality, its economic future is dictated by interest schedules, refinancing windows, and market sentiment it cannot influence. The numbers grow abstract, but the consequences are brutally concrete. More revenue is diverted to debt service. Less is available for healthcare, education, infrastructure, or investment in productive capacity. The most dangerous feature of this stage is complexity. Debt is no longer simple loans. It is layered into bonds, swaps, guarantees, and structured instruments that obscure who holds the risk and who benefits from the payments. Politicians struggle to explain it. Journalists reduce it to percentages and headlines. Citizens are told it is technical, too, complex to question. That complexity is not accidental. It protects the system from scrutiny. Currency pressure accelerates the trap. As confidence erodes, the local currency weakens. Imports become more expensive. Inflation rises. Living standards fall. But the debt, still denominated in foreign currency, grows larger in real terms. The country is working harder just to stay in the same place, transferring more of its national income outward every year. At this stage, external advice becomes mandatory. Governments are told they need credibility. Credibility means cuts, spending reductions, privatizations, labor flexibility, social protections framed as inefficiencies. The narrative is always moralized. The country must prove discipline. The population must accept pain to restore trust. What is rarely mentioned is who that trust is for. It is not for citizens, it is for creditors. Here is the quiet truth. Once a nation reaches this phase, default is portrayed as unthinkable, even when repayment is mathematically impossible. The fear of exclusion from global markets, sanctions, and financial isolation forces compliance. Debt becomes permanent, rolled over again and again, never resolved, only extended. The prison is not the debt itself. It is the belief that there is no alternative. Meanwhile, wealth extraction continues smoothly. Interest payments flow outward. Assets are prepared for sale. Strategic sectors are labeled inefficient. Public anger grows, but it is misdirected inward. Citizens blame their governments. Governments blame their people. The architects of the structure remain invisible, untouched, and profitable. This is the moment when a financial problem becomes a social one. Trust erodes. Inequality deepens. Political extremes gain ground. And yet, from the perspective of global capital, the system is working exactly as intended. A weakened nation is not a failure. It is a compliant one. When the collapse becomes impossible to deny, new actors step forward, presenting themselves not as participants in the crisis, but as its solution. This is the moment when international institutions enter the story wearing the language of rescue. Emergency funding, stabilization programs, technical assistance. The narrative shifts from growth to survival, and fear replaces optimism. These institutions claim neutrality. They speak in the language of math, models, and best practices, but their prescriptions are remarkably consistent across continents and decades. Cut public spending, raise taxes, remove subsidies, liberalize markets, privatize state assets, open strategic sectors to foreign investment. What is framed as reform is, in practice, a controlled dismantling. The justification is always the same. Confidence must be restored. Markets must be reassured. Creditors must be paid. And to achieve that, the country must sacrifice its own internal stability. Hospitals lose funding. Education budgets shrink. Public employment collapses. Wages stagnate. Social unrest grows. These outcomes are described as unfortunate but necessary side effects, never as structural consequences of the system itself. What is rarely acknowledged is timing. These institutions do not intervene at the beginning of the cycle, when reckless lending and speculative inflows are inflating bubbles. They arrive only after the collapse has already transferred risk onto the population. Losses are socialized domestically, while gains remain private. Internationally, the damage is locked in before the help begins. Conditionality is the real mechanism of control. Financial assistance is never unconditional. Every dollar comes attached to policy demands that reshape the economy permanently. Strategic industries are opened, capital controls are removed, labor protections are weakened. Once implemented, these changes are almost never reversed, even after the crisis fades. The country emerges not stronger, but structurally altered. And this is where the illusion of rescue becomes most dangerous. Citizens are told there's no alternative, that without these measures, the economy would collapse entirely. Fear silences resistance. Urgency overrides debate. Decisions that would never pass democratic scrutiny in normal times are rushed through under the pressure of crisis. From the outside, the story is framed as responsibility. From the inside, it feels like surrender. Sovereignty erodes not through invasion, but through paperwork. Not through force, but through contracts signed under duress. And once the transformation is complete, the institutions move on to the next crisis, the next country, the next opportunity. By the time the crisis reaches its peak, a strange contradiction becomes visible. While entire populations are told to tighten their belts, certain actors are doing exceptionally well. Losses are everywhere, yet fortunes are being made quietly, methodically, and legally. This is the phase where the true structure of the system reveals itself, not as broken, but as asymmetrical. Global financial elites do not experience crises the same way nations do. For them, volatility is not a threat. It is an entry point. When currencies collapse, assets are repriced. When governments are desperate, leverage shifts. What looks like chaos from the inside appears as opportunity from the outside. The same debt that suffocates a country becomes a tool to extract value from it. Banks, investment funds, and powerful families position themselves early. They anticipate defaults long before they happen. They hedge against currency devaluation. They move capital out while the public is reassured that everything is under control. When the collapse finally becomes official, they are already insulated. Some are even positioned to profit directly from the failure through credit default swaps, distressed debt purchases, and asset acquisitions. Distressed debt is where the transformation becomes irreversible. Sovereign bonds are sold at deep discounts. Funds buy them for pennies on the dollar. Then they lobby aggressively for full repayment, using international courts and institutions to enforce claims. A country that borrowed under one set of conditions now finds itself paying a different group of creditors, often more aggressive and less willing to negotiate. What began as development financing ends as legal extraction. At the same time, strategic assets quietly change hands. Ports, energy grids, water systems, mines, farmland, telecommunications, infrastructure. These are not random sales, they are targeted acquisitions. Assets that took generations to build are transferred during moments of maximum weakness. The justification is efficiency. The reality is control. And what makes this phase particularly unsettling is that it repeats with precision. The same firms appear across different crises in different regions under different names. Latin America in the 1980s, Asia in the late 1990s. Eastern Europe after the Cold War, Africa and parts of Southern Europe more recently. The geography changes, the mechanics do not. And while governments fall and leaders are replaced, these actors remain. They do not answer to voters. They are not blamed for the collapse. In fact, they are often portrayed as stabilizers, as rational forces stepping in to restore order. Their influence grows as states weaken. This is the moment when collapse stops being a tragedy and becomes a transaction. Pain is real, but it is unevenly distributed. The system does not collapse for everyone. It collapses upward, concentrating power, ownership, and influence in fewer hands each time. Once the extraction phase is secured, something subtle but powerful happens. The narrative is rewritten. The collapse is no longer framed as the result of global financial structures. asymmetrical power, or engineered dependency. Instead, the responsibility is redirected inward. The country itself becomes the culprit. Its culture, its politics, its people are placed on trial. This shift is essential to the system's survival. If collapses were widely understood as structural outcomes of global finance, the legitimacy of the entire model would be questioned. So the explanation must become moral, not mechanical. Corruption, laziness, populism, poor governance. These words replace discussions of currency mismatches, capital flight, and predatory lending. Media coverage plays a critical role here. Complex histories are compressed into simple failures. A decade of reckless inflows becomes fiscal irresponsibility. External shocks disappear from the story. The focus narrows to domestic scandals and political dysfunction. Viewers are taught to see collapses deserved, even inevitable. This reframing does something even more dangerous. It isolates the collapsing nation. Sympathy erodes. International solidarity fades. Other countries are warned not to follow the same path, not by questioning the system, but by disciplining themselves harder within it. The lesson becomes obedience, not reform. Internally, the damage compounds. Citizens are told they lived beyond their means, that sacrifices are a form of redemption. Social anger turns inward. Communities fracture. Trust between people and institutions collapses completely. Meanwhile, the external beneficiaries of the crisis fade into the background, having already secured their positions. This is the psychological endgame of the cycle. The nation not only loses assets and autonomy, it absorbs guilt. It is made to believe the collapse was its own fault, not the predictable outcome of a global structure designed to produce winners and losers. And once that belief takes hold, resistance becomes far harder, because fighting the system now feels like denying responsibility rather than reclaiming agency. This is the phase where the consequences become permanent. After blame has been assigned and austerity normalized, the country is pushed toward what is presented as the only remaining option, selling itself in pieces, not rhetorically, but literally. Assets that once symbolized sovereignty are reframed as burdens. State-owned companies are labeled inefficient. Natural resources are described as underutilized. Infrastructure is portrayed as too costly to maintain. And the solution, always the same, is privatization. The timing is not incidental. These sales happen at the absolute bottom of the cycle, when currencies are weak, valuations are depressed, and governments have no negotiating power. What took decades to build is sold in months. Ports that control trade routes, energy grids that determine national security, water systems that sustain entire populations, mines, farmland, railways, telecommunications. Each transaction is justified as a technical necessity, but collectively they represent a transfer of control that cannot be easily reversed. Foreign buyers arrive with capital that is suddenly overwhelming in local terms. What looks like a modest investment from the outside becomes decisive ownership inside the country. Profits are repatriated. Decision-making moves offshore. Pricing, access, and priorities are no longer determined by public need, but by shareholder return. The nation may still exist politically, but economically it has been hollowed out. What makes this stage particularly deceptive is the language used to sell it. Efficiency, modernization, global standards. These words mask the reality that essential services are now subject to external interests. When prices rise or access is restricted, governments are told their hands are tied by contracts signed during the crisis. Legal frameworks lock in outcomes long after the emergency has passed. This is where desperation becomes policy. Leaders facing immediate collapse trade long-term autonomy for short-term relief. And once these deals are done, reversing them becomes nearly impossible without triggering lawsuits, sanctions, or capital flight. The crisis may fade from headlines, but its consequences become structural. History shows this clearly. Countries that privatize under duress rarely regain control. They enter a new phase of dependency, where growth exists, but ownership does not. Revenue flows outward. Strategic decisions are externalized, and future generations inherit a country that functions but no longer fully belongs to them. Long after the markets stabilize and headlines move on, the real consequences of collapse continue to unfold quietly inside the country. This is the cost that never appears in balance sheets. It is measured in lost years, broken trust, and generations whose lives are permanently altered by decisions made far above them. Unemployment becomes structural, not cyclical. Jobs do not return when growth resumes because ownership has shifted and production priorities have changed. Young people enter adulthood in economies that no longer have space for them. Skilled workers leave in waves, draining the country of talent precisely when it needs it most. What is called migration in reports feels like exile on the ground. Social cohesion erodes under prolonged stress. When public services collapse and inequality deepens, communities fragment. Crime rises, not because people change, but because survival becomes uncertain. Education systems deteriorate. locking children into the same constraints their parents faced. Health outcomes worsen, not overnight, but gradually, invisibly, as prevention disappears and care becomes unaffordable. Political consequences follow. Trust in institutions collapses completely. Elections lose meaning when governments seem powerless regardless of who wins. Extremes gain traction because moderation is associated with failure. Anger becomes the dominant political currency. And once that shift occurs, stability becomes far harder to restore than any economic indicator suggests. What makes this stage especially tragic is how normalized it becomes. External observers describe it as adjustment, a necessary transition, a painful but required correction. Inside the country, it feels like abandonment. People are told recovery is underway, while their daily reality continues to deteriorate. The disconnect breeds resentment that lasts for decades. This is how cycles of collapse extend beyond economics into identity. Nations begin to see themselves as failures. Collective ambition shrinks. The future is no longer imagined in terms of possibility, but escape. And while markets may recover, societies rarely do at the same pace. There is a moment in every collapse when the conversation quietly changes. At first, the debate is about solutions, reforms, adjustments, painful but temporary sacrifices. But then, almost without anyone announcing it, the language shifts. The goal is no longer recovery. It becomes containment, survival, managing decline. This is the point of no return, when the system is no longer capable of correcting itself from within. Debt is too large to restructure meaningfully. Currency stability depends entirely on external confidence. Growth exists only on paper, driven by asset inflation rather than real production. Every lever that could restore balance is already constrained by past agreements, past dependencies, past concessions. At this stage, policy choices become illusions. Governments can change leaders, pass new laws, announce ambitious plans, but the outcomes remain the same. Interest payments dominate budgets. External conditions dictate internal policy. Any attempt to deviate triggers immediate punishment from markets through capital flight, currency attacks, or credit downgrades. The message is clear. Compliance is rewarded, deviation is not. What makes this phase so dangerous is that it often looks calm on the surface. After years of crisis, volatility subsides, markets adjust, investors adapt. A new equilibrium forms, but it is an equilibrium built on weakness. Wages remain low, ownership remains external. Strategic decisions are no longer domestic. The country functions, but it no longer directs its own future. This is where cycles lock in across generations. Children grow up in economies shaped by decisions made before they were born. Public debate becomes cynical because people sense, correctly, that fundamental change is no longer available through normal channels. Politics turns performative. Elections change faces, not trajectories. Historically, this is the stage that precedes one of two outcomes. Either prolonged stagnation, where a country remains trapped in low growth and dependency for decades, or a disruptive rupture that breaks the system entirely. Neither path is gentle. Both are consequences of reaching a point where gradual reform is no longer sufficient. And this is the uncomfortable truth. By the time the point of no return is recognized publicly, it has already passed. The warning signs were visible much earlier, during the boom, during the optimism, during the easy credit. But those moments are never remembered as dangerous until it is too late. After the cycle has fully played out, something remarkable happens. The crisis fades from memory, but the structure it created remains. New narratives emerge, carefully framed, widely repeated, and rarely challenged. The collapse is rebranded as a difficult chapter that led to modernization. The losses are described as unfortunate, but necessary. And the beneficiaries quietly step forward as partners in recovery. This is where power reveals its most subtle advantage: control over memory. History is not written by those who lost their savings, their jobs, or their future. It is written by those who acquired assets, stabilized returns, and positioned themselves as indispensable during the rebuilding phase. The same actors who benefited from the collapse now shape how it is remembered. Textbooks simplify the story. Media. Retrospectives focus on domestic mistakes. International institutions publish reports emphasizing resilience and reform. The deeper mechanics of extraction are rarely revisited. Over time, the idea that the collapse was inevitable becomes accepted wisdom. The system itself escapes scrutiny. So what replaces the old economy often looks functional, but it is fundamentally altered. Ownership is concentrated. Decision-making is externalized. Growth exists, but it serves different interests. And the population adapts, not because conditions are just, but because survival demands it. This adaptation is often mistaken for recovery. Globally, the lesson absorbed by other nations is not caution, but compliance. They are taught to manage risk within the system, not question the system itself. And so the cycle continues. New emerging markets rise. New credit booms begin. New promises are made. The pattern resets, refined but unchanged. The most dangerous aspect of this process is how invisible. It becomes over time. Once normalized, it no longer feels like exploitation. It feels like reality, like the natural order of global finance. And that acceptance is what allows the cycle to repeat again and again across generations, across continents. Understanding this is not about pessimism. It is about clarity. Because only by recognizing how fraud, collapse, and enrichment are structurally connected can nations and people begin to imagine alternatives. Not guaranteed escapes, but informed resistance to repetition. If you made it this far, you now understand something most people never see. Global collapses are not random accidents, and they are not evenly shared. They follow patterns, they reward specific players, and they leave long shadows that shape entire generations. If this video changed how you see debt, development, and global power, subscribe to the channel. This is where we break down the hidden mechanics behind crises, frauds, and systemic collapses that rarely make it into mainstream narratives. Leave a like if you believe more people need to understand how these cycles really work. And leave a comment with the exact phrase, "The cycle is not broken." So I know you stayed until the very end and followed the full argument. Now keep watching. The next video appearing on your screen goes even deeper into how these systems evolved and what happens when the cycle finally fails to reset.